Imagine a man in chains, trained to perform violence for an audience that considered his life a form of entertainment, owned entirely by another person, with no legal existence of his own. Now imagine that man deciding, with around 70 others in roughly the same condition, that they had nothing left to lose. Tonight, I am here with Rowan Hot Steel.
Good evening, Clara.
From that moment, a rebellion grew that would occupy the attention of the most powerful military state in the ancient world. Resistance in human history. Tonight, we turn to a man who challenged Rome not with a political program or a noble bloodline, but with the refusal to accept the condition into which he had been forced. The question tonight is not only what Spartacus did, but what his story reveals about the limits of empire and the cost of treating human beings as property.
In 73, before the Common Era, a group of enslaved gladiators escaped from a training facility in the city of Capua, armed with kitchen implements, and took refuge on the slopes of Mount Vesuvius. Within 2 years, their leader had defeated multiple Roman armies, attracted tens of thousands of followers, and driven the Senate of Rome to a response reserved for existential threats.
We are speaking about Spartacus,
a man about whom we know surprisingly little in direct historical terms, but whose actions shook the foundations of the Roman Republic at one of its most powerful moments.
Then let us begin with the world he was born into, the Rome that made a man like him both possible and necessary.
The Roman Republic of the 1st century before the Common Era was the dominant power in the Mediterranean world. Its legions had conquered Spain, North Africa, Greece, and much of the Near East. Its wealth was staggering. Its political culture was sophisticated, producing philosophers, lawyers, and statesmen of extraordinary ability. And at the foundation of all of it was slavery, not as a marginal institution, but as the central engine of Roman economic life.
So Rome's civilization was built on the labor of people who had no rights within IT.
Yes. Estimates suggest that by the late Republic, enslaved people made up between 30 and 40% of the population of Italy. They worked the great agricultural estates, the mines, the workshops, the households. They built the roads, the aqueducts, the temples. They raised Roman children and managed Roman finances. In Roman law, an enslaved person was not a person. They were property, with no legal standing, no right to family, no protection from the will of their owner.
So the system that produced Spartacus was not an aberration. It was Rome's core structure.
Exactly. And within that system, gladiators occupied a particularly brutal position. Gladiatorial combats was a form of public spectacle, rooted originally in funeral rites and developed over centuries into a vast entertainment industry. Gladiators were owned by wealthy individuals called lanistae, who housed them in specialized schools, trained them with professional rigor, and rented or sold their services to sponsors of public games. The training was serious and the diet was carefully managed, because a well-trained gladiator was a significant financial investment. But the life was one of permanent confinement, constant physical punishment, and the ever-present possibility of a violent end.
So the gladiatorial school was...
Yes, and the school where Spartacus was held was run by a man named Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Batiatus, based in Capua, in the Campania region of southern Italy. Capua was one of the largest cities in Italy at the time, prosperous and strategically located. Its gladiatorial school was among the most prominent in the Republic. Spartacus himself was almost certainly of Thracian origin. Thrace was a region in what is now the Northern Balkans, a territory Rome had brought into its sphere of influence through conquest and alliance.
So he came from outside Rome, captured in the process of Roman expansion.
Yes. Ancient sources suggest he may have served as an auxiliary soldier in Roman forces before deserting or being captured. He may have had military training before he was enslaved. Plutarch, writing more than a century later, described him as a man of intelligence and culture beyond his station, possessing more of the Greek than the barbarian in his nature. This framing tells us more about Roman and Greek biases than about Spartacus himself. What the sources agree on is that he was physically exceptional, strategically gifted, and capable of inspiring the loyalty of people in desperate circumstances.
So a man of considerable ability, reduced by conquest to the status of property, held in a facility designed to extract value from his body until that body gave out.
Yes. And in 73 before the Common Era, around 200 gladiators in the school of Batiatus began planning an escape. The plot was discovered before it could fully execute, but approximately 70 to 80 men broke free regardless. seizing kitchen tools and cooking implements as the only weapons available to them. Along the road outside Capua, they encountered wagons carrying gladiatorial weapons intended for another school. They seized those weapons, armed themselves properly, and the character of the group changed in an instant.
So within hours of escaping, they had transformed from a group of fugitives into something armed and organized.
Yes, they moved south and took a position on the slopes of Mount Vesuvius, which at that time was not an active volcano but a heavily forested mountain with natural defensive advantages. Rome's initial response was dismissive. The Senate dispatched a small force under a praetor named Gaius Claudius Glaber, not a full legion but a hastily assembled militia, because the situation was not yet considered a military threat. Glaber's forces surrounded the mountain, locking the main path down, and waited for the fugitives to surrender or starve.
So Rome expected the problem to resolve itself.
Yes, this was the first of many miscalculations. Spartacus had his men weave ropes from wild vines and descend the sheer cliff face on the opposite side of the mountain, the side the Romans had not bothered to watch. They came around behind the Roman camp and attacked from the rear. Glaber's forces, caught completely unprepared, fled. The rebels took the Roman weapons and equipment.
So, the first engagement ended with Rome's own weapons, arming the rebellion further.
Yes, and the news spread quickly through the slave population of the surrounding countryside. Enslaved agricultural workers from the great estates of Campania began leaving their fields and joining the rebel force. The group that had escaped from Capua with kitchen knives now numbered in the thousands. Rome sent another larger force under 2 more praetors. Spartacus defeated them as well, systematically using terrain deception and the disciplined fighting skills of a core group of trained gladiators to compensate for the larger force's advantages.
So he was not simply leading a mob. He was commanding with strategic intelligence.
Exactly. And this is the myth-busting element that the sources support. The popular image of the slave revolt as a desperate, disorganized uprising is not what the historical record shows. Spartacus organized his forces into units. He drilled them. He imposed discipline. He established a command structure, sharing leadership with 2 other figures named Crixus and Oenoas, both Gallic gladiators who had escaped with him from Capua. He also, crucially, equipped his army from the enemy. Every Roman force defeated meant more weapons, more armor, more trained soldiers absorbed into the rebel ranks.
So each victory strengthened the rebellion in ways that went beyond the immediate military outcome.
Yes, by the winter of 73 to 72 before the Common Era, the rebel army may have numbered as many as 70,000 people, possibly more. They had moved north through southern Italy, living off the land, pillaging the estates whose enslaved workers they liberated as they passed. The scale of the threat was now undeniable. Rome had not faced anything like this on Italian soil since Hannibal.
So what did Spartacus actually want? What was the goal beyond survival?
This is one of the most debated questions in the entire story, and the honest answer is that we do not know with certainty. The most commonly proposed interpretation is that Spartacus sought to lead his followers out of Italy entirely, north across the Alps and back to their homelands in Thrace, Gaul, Germany, and elsewhere. If this was his plan, it suggests he had no illusion of defeating Rome permanently. He wanted escape rather than revolution, dispersal rather than the destruction of the system that had enslaved his followers.
So the goal may have been freedom for those involved, not the transformation of Rome.
That is the most defensible reading of the evidence. But here the internal tensions of the rebellion become critical. The rebel army was not a unified group with a single objective. It contained people from dozens of different ethnic backgrounds, different languages, different experiences of enslavement, and different visions of what victory would mean. Crixus, one of the other leaders, disagreed with Spartacus about whether to march north. He preferred to remain in southern Italy, raiding and fighting. In the winter of 72, he separated from the main force with a substantial contingent. He was defeated, and his life ended in battle against a Roman consular force. His followers were largely scattered or killed.
So the rebellion's greatest weakness may have been the impossibility of keeping such a diverse force, unified around a single purpose.
Yes, and this is what made it structurally different from a conventional military campaign. Rome could replace fallen commanders and draw on centuries of institutional military knowledge. The rebel army had Spartacus, and what he could hold together, through force of personality and military success. When the main rebel force marched north and reached the Alpine foothills, they halted. The ancient sources offer conflicting explanations, some suggesting the soldiers refused to continue, preferring to remain in Italy where there was still plunder to be had.
So even at the moment when escape was possible, the army turned back?
Yes. and Rome responded to the escalating crisis by reaching for its most capable available commander. Marcus Licinius Crassus was one of the wealthiest men in Rome, a figure of enormous political ambition who had long sought the military glory that would place him alongside Pompey and Julius Caesar in the Republic's highest tier of power. He took command of 8 legions, more than 40,000 trained soldiers, with the authority to conduct the campaign as he saw fit. He was also a severe disciplinarian. When 2 of his legions were routed early in the campaign, Crassus executed every 10th man in the defeated units, a punishment called decimation that had not been used in living memory.
So Crassus frightened his own soldiers into fighting harder than they had been.
Yes, and he combined this with strategic methodism. He drove Spartacus and the main rebel force south into the toe of the Italian peninsula, the region of Bruttium, and then built a fortification wall across the entire width of the peninsula. Approximately 55 kilometers of ditches, walls and fencing, constructed in weeks, designed to trap the rebel army without battle and let hunger do the work.
So Crassus intended to contain rather than confront.
Yes, Spartacus attempted a crossing to Sicily, hoping to open a new front, but the Sicilian pirates he had contracted to provide ships took his money and departed, cut off from Sicily. Facing a fortified wall to the north and the sea on 3 sides, Spartacus chose to break through. On a winter night his forces filled a section of the ditch with earth and timber, and forced their way through the Roman line. A significant portion of the rebel army escaped north, but the escape was costly, and the force was now fragmented, exhausted, and beginning to fracture under the accumulated pressure.
So the escape through the wall was a tactical success, but not a strategic reversal.
No, and then came the news that changed the calculus entirely. Pompey the Great, Rome's most celebrated general, was returning from campaigns in Spain. Lucullus was returning from Asia Minor. The Senate had recalled both specifically to deal with the rebellion. Spartacus now faced not one Roman force, but 3 converging armies, with Crassus still in pursuit from the south.
So the full weight of the Republic was being brought to bear at last.
Yes, and rather than attempt to outmaneuver all 3 forces, Spartacus turned and offered battle directly to Crassus. Whether this was strategic boldness or an acceptance that there was no longer a path to survival, the sources do not say. What they do say is that Spartacus understood what the outcome was likely to be. Before the final battle, he was reportedly offered his horse and refused it, saying that if they won, he could take any horse he wanted from the Romans, and if they lost, he would not need one.
So he went into the last battle with clarity about what it meant.
Yes, the battle took place in Lucania in 71, before the common Erots. Spartacus attempted to fight his way through to Crassus personally. The ancient sources record that he was wounded, that he fought on, and that his body was never recovered after the battle. The rebel army was destroyed. Thousands who survived the battle were captured. Crassus ordered 6,000 of them crucified along the Appian Way, the great road stretching from Rome to Capua, the road that Spartacus had once threatened.
So the road that connected the city of his enslavement to Rome became the site of the final message.
Yes, the crucifixions along the Appian Way were not merely punishment, they were communication. Every person who traveled that road for weeks afterward would see those crosses. The message was directed not primarily at the defeated rebels, but at every enslaved person still in chains throughout Italy. Rome was demonstrating what the cost of resistance looked like, with a thoroughness designed to prevent the question from being raised again.
Before we close tonight, let us take a brief pause and welcome Margaret Evernight. Margaret, for those who want to understand the full story of Spartacus and separate the history from the legend, where would you invite them to begin?
Thank you, Clara. In this case, the most direct path is also the most important one. I would suggest beginning with Spartacus by Barry Strauss.
So this is a dedicated historical account, rather than a general history of Rome.
It is a gripping historical account of Spartacus and the slave revolt, combining military analysis with human drama to separate myth from reality. Strauss is a military historian with a real feel for tactical detail, and he takes the question of Spartacus as a commander seriously, rather than treating him as merely a symbol.
Is it accessible to a reader without a background in ancient history?
Entirely. It reads more like narrative history than academic scholarship. Strauss is honest about the limits of the evidence, while still building a compelling and coherent account of what the sources allow us to reconstruct.
So reading it gives you the man and the war, with the myths carefully set aside.
Precisely, and in a story this layered with later invention, that clarity is exactly what the reader needs.
Thank you, Margaret. That is a thoughtful place to pause tonight.
Thank you, Clara. It was a pleasure.
The immediate legacy of the rebellion was enforced silence. Rome moved quickly to restore order and to ensure that the structural conditions that had made the revolt possible remained intact. The slave economy was not reformed. The gladiatorial schools continued. No legislation was passed to address the conditions that had produced the rebellion. The Third Servile War, as historians now call it, was treated by Roman writers primarily as a military embarrassment rather than a social crisis.
So Rome absorbed the shock without examining what had caused it.
Yes. But what Rome could not do was erase the memory of what had happened. Ancient writers who mentioned Spartacus could not entirely suppress a certain reluctant admiration. Plutarch, who wrote of him disapprovingly as an enemy of Rome, nonetheless described his courage, his discipline, and his care for those who followed him. Florus, a Roman historian, wrote that Spartacus had conducted himself with such nobility that it was difficult to say whether he was worthy of greater praise or condemnation.
So even Rome's own historians could not quite make him into a simple villain.
No. And in the centuries that followed, his story was repeatedly claimed by those who needed a symbol. Voltaire admired. Karl Marx called him one of the finest fellows in all of ancient history. The revolutionary movements of the 19th and 20th centuries saw in him the archetype of the oppressed rising against the system that held them. The German revolutionary organization that preceded the Weimar Republic called itself the Spartacist League. Stanley Kubrick's film made his name synonymous with defiance in the popular imagination of the 20th century.
So the historical Spartacus has been almost entirely absorbed by the symbolic one.
Yes, and this is where the honest account requires some caution. The historical Spartacus was not fighting to abolish slavery as an institution. There is no evidence he sought to transform Roman society. His followers included people who owned enslaved people themselves before their own capture. The rebellion was about freedom for those involved in it, not freedom as a universal political principle. Projecting modern abolitionist ideas onto ancient events distorts both the history and the achievement.
So, the actual Spartacus was already remarkable enough without needing to be made into something he was not.
Yes, what he actually did was extraordinary on its own terms. With no institutional support, no political legitimacy, no access to the resources of the state, a man who had been legally reduced to the status of property, organized an army, defeated Rome's military forces repeatedly, and sustained a rebellion for nearly 3 years. He did not defeat Rome, but he exposed something Rome preferred not to acknowledge, that the system rested on the compliance of those it exploited, and that compliance was not guaranteed.
So his greatest impact may have been the question he forced Rome to confront.
Yes, and that question did not go away when the last cross was raised on the Appian Way. Rome's slave economy continued for centuries after Spartacus. The institution he fought within outlasted the Republic, the Empire, and most of the civilizations that came after. But so did his name. In every generation that has faced a system that treats human beings as tools, someone has reached for it.
So the symbol survived precisely because the condition it expressed did not end with Rome.
Yes, Spartacus did not defeat Rome, but he exposed its vulnerabilities. And even the most powerful systems can be shaken when those at the bottom refuse to remain there.
Thank you for staying with us tonight. And thank you, Rowan, for guiding us through the life and legacy of the man who made Rome afraid of its own foundations.
He was a man who had been told by every institution around him that he was nothing, and who chose to prove otherwise. That proof cost him everything, and it has not been forgotten.
If this conversation stayed with you, you are welcome to like, comment, and subscribe. You will find other episodes here where history, ideas, and power are approached slowly. Until next time, stay with us.